quite interesting that we are marking it at a time where we again go through very historic circumstances, just as we did 30 years ago when the Soviet Union was dissolved. The dissolution of the Soviet Union took place with a failed coup in August of 1991 against Gorbachev. And later on, Yeltsin, Ukraine's President Kravchuk, and the Belarus President Shushkevich met in the forest of Belarishka in Belarus. And I just want to mention that Shushkevich just died this week. So it's actually, in many ways, it is sort of making the round. And he died of course, he was an elder man, but he died of COVID-related circumstances. So these are the times that we're actually living through. But now we have this conference in the middle of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And, you know, I think what we actually see these days is actually the real dissolution of the Soviet Union. It's taking place because the countries that came out of the Soviet Union are becoming and have become independent in their own rights. And for a country like, or for an empire like the Soviet Union, for Russia, it's a very difficult process to watch. Not that we should feel sympathetic to what they're doing, but it's just, I think, to have an understanding of it all. I really look forward to all the presenters today from the different countries that came out of the Soviet Union, who were often also independent before the Soviet Union, so they regained actually independence coming out of the Soviet Union, and what has actually happened and how they tackled the process. But one thing is sure, they have independent foreign policies, they have independent institutions, they have independent identities, national identities, and all this is part and parcel of being an independent country. So this is I look forward to. So I will give the word, first of all, to Martin Lidegaard from the Social Liberal Party, and who also has extensive experience working in, I know, Belarus, bicycling through Russia, and also being Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Climate and Energy in very crucial times. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the initiative. Thank you for all of you coming to the Parliament, and welcome to the Parliament. I'm very honored to host this conference on behalf of the Foreign Policy Committee. Actually, I didn't bicycle through Russia, I bicycled through Ukraine. It was a long trip, and then we started bicycling through Russia. But then I became foreign minister and I was not allowed to continue our trip. So we had two mountain bikes in Lidegaard standing there waiting probably for some time yet to continue that trip. What can we learn from history and what can we not learn from history? These two questions are equally important. I know as a historian by profession that you can learn something, and especially in these times, we need to look back to see whether we can catch some of the solutions, understand some of the challenges by learning from history. But it's also very clear that there are new things we cannot learn from history, and that the understanding and perception of history is very, very different, and the narratives we can see in Russia, in Ukraine, Denmark are very different when we look at the period which is the focus today. And I am so sad that I cannot participate in the whole conference, because I would love to hear each and every input you get today. They are relevant and they will give you, I'm sure, different perspectives and different narratives and put different light on this period we're going to discuss today, giving hopefully a better understanding of the situation we have today and what we can do. I have been asked to talk a little about the Danish foreign policy relations with the countries of the former Soviet Union in '91 and now. It's a great item. So let me go rather quickly through the historical part of that, because I know that Uffe and others will dive more deeply into that. But I think it's fair to say that in general, Danish foreign policy has always been placed somewhere between Washington, D.C. and Berlin. There have been forces in Danish foreign policy who would like us to be more oriented to the US, and who have taken us more into the Atlantic, typically decided for Rasmussen. But there's also been forces who would like to take us more into the European context and be more, so to speak, independent on the American point of views. Typically the more leftist part of the Danish Parliament. But in general, there has been broad consensus that the special thing about Danish foreign policy is that we are very pro-Atlantic. We have a special relationship to the US, also due to the Arctic and our special history there, whereas we at the same time have been very concerned about our relations to Germany, and that the big country just south of us is crucial to Danish interests through history, the two world wars, etc. So our relations to both former Soviet Union and the post-Soviet countries is no exception from that. We have balanced our relationships. The way we handle the fall of the Berlin Wall, the way we quite quickly recognized one of the countries who were first recognizing both the Baltic countries, but also other ex-Yugoslavian countries and former Soviet Union countries, is a consequence of both wanting to act in a way which was very pro-American, because they wanted us to stand firm to both Soviet Union, but also afterwards, but also being very pro-European, because we were one of the countries very eager to expand the European Union, to put up the Copenhagen criteria in the year 2000, and have been first and foremost very concerned about how do we actually develop a policy not only to welcome the new countries, but also to ensure as much as we can a democratic and economic development in the very same countries, which is a very European way of thinking. And this balance has continued through the 90s and through the first decade of the new century. Then came Georgia in 2008, because if you could add something to this balance when it comes to Soviet Union and later Russia, is of course that the Arctic question and the desire of a low-tension development within the Kingdom of Denmark, both in Greenland, Faroe Islands and ourselves, it has been a target in itself to try to keep low tension with Russia. And the Lucette Declaration from 2008 was a milestone in that sense, which was a former Foreign Minister, Pedersen, took the initiative to that, and it's been a very clear focus through all the years since 2008 that the balance between US and Berlin, Europe, and at the same time trying to handle the Arctic through a peaceful, UN-based orientation. It became more difficult after 2008, and it became much more difficult after the annexation of the Crimea in 2014. This was another milestone. I took office myself as Foreign Minister during that period, and also in these years, Denmark played a role in balancing what you could call the Polish-Baltic approach and the German approach. Germany being much more reluctant in very hard sanctions, much more reluctant in welcoming new NATO members, both because of the dependency of gas, but also, in all fairness, due to the history and their concern about how the long-term stability with Russia. B, whereas the Baltic countries, Poland and other former East European countries, Warsaw countries, they were much more scared and much more eager to put up hard consequences after the Crimea annexation, and the Danish role being to try to balance the two approaches in order to do what we considered, and I considered as the most important thing, to ensure European unity. That Russia would not succeed in putting a split against West and Eastern Europe, or South and North, but that we were able to stay united, both internally with the European Union, but also with the United States. And we succeeded doing so. I think I counted some weeks ago, I think I participated in 23 council meetings among foreign ministers during this period. In all of them, we arrived in disagreement, and we left the meetings in agreement. It was not easy. It was not easy at all. And many have asked me today, should we put stronger sanctions? Should we have put greater measures? Maybe we should, but I would still say that the most important thing was the signal that we stood and said united. And that the annexation of Crimea was not as bloody as we see the present aggressive war in Ukraine. It was the possible way to go by that time. But it also marked in 2014 the first, I would say, really disagreement with Germany on how to handle Russia in the years to come, especially the question about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, where Denmark quite quickly took the stand that this was not a good idea under the present circumstances, and where Germany, for reasons I still don't understand, insisted that that project should continue and put a split through the European Union. I'm saying that as a big fan of Germany in general and their role in the European Union, but in this matter, they got it wrong as I saw it and see it. And it was a very difficult situation in the relationship between Germany and Denmark, and we have been arguing for that. But so it came as a big relief when Germany took the decision quite early in this new, after the 24th February situation, that they would stop the project. And I think it's fair to say that German policy has developed drastically in the last 2 months. Some still saying not drastically enough. I tend to say that still there has been complete agreement in the European Council on all these subjects, including Germany, and that Germany has taken initiatives and decisions which we would think unthinkable a few months ago, and that has changed, as I see it, the whole picture of the European Union. It has created a new security architecture which is still to be developed, but with an access going from Berlin to Paris, but probably also to Warsaw. And that's one of the reasons why me, myself, and my party is so strong reckoning that we will get out of the dropout on defense policy from the European Union, because we see a big development coming now, which we need to take part of in order to secure that we will get a comprehensive understanding of how the EU should perform its security policy, not only in the defense matters, but also when it comes to trade, when it comes to energy, when it comes to migration, and I see no reason for Denmark not taking full part of that as the only country in the European Union. But where we are standing right now, it's also clear that these dramatic changes due to the war in Ukraine has made changes where we cannot fully see the consequences. It's not obvious where this will end because we don't know what the end game will be in Ukraine yet. Still, I would claim today that we need a plan for how our relationship should be, both to the post-war Ukraine and to the post-war and post-Putin Russia. And how the post-war situation and post-Putin situation should be handled in the Arctic. Why? Ukraine, obviously, because we need now to begin the build-up of a new Ukraine as quickly as possible. We should actually be much more concrete when it comes to the Solidarity Fund, which has been established in the European Union. And we need to make a division of labor where different European countries and the US will take responsibility for the build-up of infrastructure, of a new energy system, of huge economic investments in Ukraine, because it seems now as the war will be longer than we expected, and will not only be a war which will be concluded by military terms, but also by economic terms. We need to invest in the western part of Ukraine. We need to give hope to European people, and we need to build up, especially outclaim, a new energy system, which is also more independent, both on Russia, but also independent of the oligarchs internally in Ukraine, and which will be a safe, clean, and cheap energy system, which could provide energy for a new industry and a new economy in Ukraine. And I see no country better equipped for being a driver in that than Denmark, which has long experience with establishing the modern energy security systems both in India, Mexico, Africa, and other countries. So we need a plan for that. It should be EU-based, but Denmark should definitely take a very strong and active part in that, as I see it. But we also need to think about how post-Russia and post-Putin Russia will look like. I find it very hard to imagine that we will be able to open up the Arctic Council to get back to business as usual as long as we have Mr. Putin leading the Russian Federation. It's going to be extremely difficult to establish trust, to make agreements which will not be at least secured by international institutions and international troops if we can get there. But I find it hard to see we can get there. How should the Ukrainians ever trust in a Putin-led Russia? On the other hand, it's also clear that Russia will not disappear. Russia will be there, and that the enemy is not the Russian people, it's the Russian machine. And we need to also show the Russian people that there is an alternative. There is an alternative, and what that alternative could be. Let me give you some few examples. I actually believe that finally, I've argued for this since the Crimean annexation, but finally I actually think that the European Union is able and willing to stop the import of fossil fuels from Russia. It will take some years, but the plan will be delivered later this month, and we can do it faster than we thought very few years ago. And we need to do it both for security reasons, but also for climate reasons. But that will leave Russia, of course, economy in the longer term in a quite dramatic situation. And it cannot be a perspective for decades that Russia should be a very, very poor at this point country. It's too dangerous, simply. So what we could establish is the scenario or the vision that the day Russia, a new Russian leader, may decide to go for a European partnership instead of the EU as an enemy, we are also ready to invest in a more diverse economy in Russia, and we're willing to establish more expanded corporations, both when it comes to people-to-people activities, but also economic investments. It's a paradox to talk about such a thing today.
I called some central persons at home, Prime Minister, leading parliamentarians, etc. They agreed. So in the evening of that Saturday, we made public that Denmark would re-establish diplomatic relations with the three Baltic countries, and that an ambassador would be on his way. The next morning, I was sitting at the breakfast table in my home. It was Sunday morning, and then the phone called. That was my good friend and colleague Hans-Dietrich Genscher from Germany. And he said, Uffe, 5 people are telling me that Denmark has re-established diplomatic relations with the three Baltic countries. Is that true? Yes. But Uffe, didn't we agree that we should communicate with each other before taking that kind of steps? Yes, but you didn't call me. No, because you would have asked me to wait, and I would not wait, and I would not tell my good friend that I didn't want to follow his advice. Silence for a moment, then he said, du bist frisch. I will support you if you get into problems, and don't worry, I will do everything I can to follow up. And he did. And you know, that was the wonderful thing, that this was a window of opportunity. We had an opportunity in Denmark to open that window, and suddenly a lot of things happened after that. And it all culminated, of course, with the EU membership and the NATO membership. It took a long and difficult time to get there. Well, I was no longer in government, but the government that took over after us certainly did not miss any possibility to support that process. And my old political enemy, Nyrup Rasmussen, who was Prime Minister, he did a wonderful job in supporting NATO membership for the three Baltic countries when it was difficult to get through. I was in Vilnius the morning when we had celebrated the enlargement of NATO in Prague the day before. And the American President, George W. Bush, he was in Vilnius, and he would give a speech. It was the morning of November the 23rd. It was damn cold, I tell you. People who had been standing there on the town hall square in Vilnius, they had been freezing for hours. But then came Bush, and Bush gave a speech, and he said in that speech, and I quote, "Anyone who would choose Lithuania as an enemy has also made an enemy of the United States." And people started to hear, achoo, 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 like they were sneezing, which one might understand, I suppose that's it was. And I heard Bush asking the president of Lithuania, who was there, Adamkus, what are they saying? What are they saying? And Adamkus said, achoo in Lithuanian means thank you. Bush said, you're welcome. And this day, if any of you should go to Vilnius, I can recommend that, also a beautiful city, you will see on the town hall, there's a plate with this quote from George W. Bush that gives the whole essence of NATO membership, the musketeer oath, so to say. Well, I think I'll stop here because you now have the three Baltic countries as EU members without reservations like some other EU members I could mention, members of the Euro, of course. They are highly respected members of NATO, on three of them above the 2% promise about how to pay to NATO. So one might feel tempted to say, mission accomplished, but, and I'm sure that will be a topic of your further discussions at this conference. The mission is not accomplished, it is not ended. It is still necessary for smaller countries in our region to stick together in order to defend our freedom. Thank you. Have a good conference.
I think it is quite interesting that in the Danish Russian Society there was a meeting opening of an exhibition about Andrei Sakharov, the 20th of February. An exhibition financed by the Vista Foundation about this outstanding person who was one of the key persons in actually bringing down the Soviet Union by his personal courage and with a very interesting career. This is the exhibition is now in Aalborg, but the curious thing is that this was, I would say, one of the last occasions there was to make some sort of common event between the Danish Russian Society and the official Russia. Because some awful things happened, as we all know, between that. And to many it was totally unexpected that the invasion should take place on the 24th of February. It is quite clear that it is not an attempt to restore the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was built on another foundation than a great Russian historical thought and other phenomena. It was built on actually an idea of an equality of nations and an equality of people. Of course, we all know that that society where Mikhail Gorbachev took the lead in 1985 was not like that. It was, for those who have been and traveled in the Soviet Union, be cooperating with people in culture and science and in church, we all know that the Soviet society was in a highly critical state, with aging leaders who felt needed to open their borders, also the borders information to foreign countries, to foreign people. And here the important year is perhaps 1975, which was not only the year of the Nobel Prize to Andrei Sakharov. It didn't make him very popular in the Peace Prize in the Soviet Union. And he was then one of the most important dissenters. And in Italy you can find it in Gorky, now Nizhny Novgorod. But the 1975 is also important because of the Helsinki Agreement in 1st August, which not only guaranteed the borders in Europe, but also guaranteed human rights to some extent. And this guarantee, well, we all know how much it was often worth, but it actually opened some doors. It opened, and it was quite clear that in order to develop, the Soviet Union had in some way to come out of an isolation. And talking about Germany, which has been mentioned here before, the German Ostpolitik was one of the means through which the Soviet Union was challenged by Western value amendments and initiatives that also contributed to putting in demands to Soviet society which it was not able to fulfill. There was sort of contract in the Soviet Union between people who let the party govern in exchange for having a small improvement of their living standards, of possibilities each year. But that contract wasn't fulfilled because the Soviet Union went into various crises due to the lack of, well, you would say it was characterized by poor analysis and wishful thinking. These are actually the basic phenomena in the Soviet Union and the reasons for its downfall. Then, at length, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and started on his perestroika and glasnost. And here, well, the perestroika was sometimes relatively chaotic, and well, it succeeded in the downfall of the Soviet Union. That was not his intention, certainly not, and the downfall of communism. But the most important was glasnost, transparency, because the whole system was based on non-transparency. It was based on corruption on all levels, also in the, or rather on the family level, you would say, or friendship level. I often traveled in those years in the Soviet Union as a film scholar in cooperation with the All-Union Institute for Film. I was in the jury of the Moscow Film Festival, where, by the way, some films were screened which were not screened to the Russian public, because on one side, Russia, the Soviet Union wanted to compete with world cinema, on the stage of world cinema, and they produced excellent films. There were people like Tarkovsky, who can be mentioned as one of the great film directors of that time. But we had an agreement with the University of Copenhagen, where I was, that we, at each second year, there would be one film scholar or producer from the Soviet Union invited to Denmark. But when we tried to invite Tarkovsky, we were told either that his mother was sick, also after she was died, or other curious reasons. And in the end, Tarkovsky was actually sent in exile. What I experienced with good friends in Soviet Russia, that was that there was a very strong culture, but it was a counter-culture. It was a literature, we can mention now a man, Kurkov, Andrei Kurkov, who yesterday gave a lecture in the Copenhagen University. He was actually born a Russian in then Leningrad, but moved to Kiev when he was 2 years old. He was raised in Ukraine, considers himself Ukrainian, but he writes in Russian and still does. One of the examples which I will return to when we talk about national identity in the former Soviet Union and in the successor states, because it is not a question of which language you are speaking. It is perhaps more a question about what is your world orientation, what are your ideals. But here's one of the not few examples of Ukrainians who are, have Russian as their mother tongue. But this is the case for many of those from nationalities around in the Soviet Union. It was a melting pot for good and for worse. And this was what actually the idea of the Soviet Union was, exactly the question of equality of nations. But of course the Russian nation was much bigger, and the Russian language was speaking for by much more people. But the republics played a certain role in the texture. And when elites in the republics lost faith in the future within the Soviet Union, a process started which was dangerous for the Union. So ethnic tensions was one of the first things where you really could see the cracks in society. The Armenian-Azeri conflict in the Caucasus. It was one of the places where it started. Or in present-day Moldova with Transnistria. A series of the conflicts we are still not solved today were a consequence of the nationality policy of the Soviet Union, which was based on the existence of one singular party governing it all and controlling it all. There was no particular Russian Communist Party because that people didn't think was necessary, but in all the other republics there were Communist parties. But this means there were also local elites. And one of the early problems Gorbachev ran into was when he put, in his view, effective Russian in the head of Kazakhstan, the party of Kazakhstan. Because until then it had been a native Kazakh who had been party leader there. And that was part of, you could say, the culture, the nature of the Union, that it should be so. And this created protests. And protests appeared in various cases, and then actually, I don't think that Gorbachev himself saw how difficult it was, how dangerous it was. Then there were all the global promises. The promises of progress, the promises of better consumer relations. In a lot of ways, the late Soviet Union performed very, very badly, and only the media were there to cover it up. But that was again made impossible by the glasnost, the transparency, which created more and more of a free press. And in the end, also by the initiative of Sakharov, the party monopoly on power was put down. Gorbachev was confronted by Sakharov himself in a new People's Assembly, and he there demanded that not only one party should have the possibility to stand for elections. And Gorbachev didn't react against it, and that then in 90 and 91 became the new situation. This means that the party itself was crumbled. And so the glue keeping the Soviet Union together was beginning to slip. And in this situation, with all the dangerous sides of sovereignty declarations for one or another or third republic, and most dangerous of all, perhaps, from Ukraine, who had a rather oppositional attitude in this situation, there was made the counter-coup against Gorbachev by Yanayev and his followers, which actually paved the way for the total collapse of the Soviet Union. And this, yes, thank you, and this changed the whole situation. Well, it was such a one which fall to the ground. It has Trump and Putin on its head, but well, it started with some other figures, but also tells about another thing, that Russia has a tendency, and the Soviet Union had a tendency, of always considering the United States as the only valid adversary, partner, and so to speak, counterpart in the world order. But Sakharov is important because he also was the one who fight for international cooperation and reconciliation because he knew how dangerous the atomic bomb is. And that is actually, unfortunately, what again is at the agenda now. The threat of nuclear warfare is on the table again, and that is really a very threatening sign. So that's where we stand. In a curious way, there was a don't touch too much in this process. And Uffe Ellemann has very, in a very fine way, he has actually written Trump for again. There was again a situation there where some of the small nations made some initiatives which were actually pushing the world order in some way. But behind it all is that in both in a good and in a very bad way, the present situation is mirroring the insecurity which was going on around 1991, not only in the world as such, but also both in countries like Ukraine, Russia, the Baltic countries, and other of the successor states of the late Soviet Union. Thank you.
The political narratives in Russian media from 1991 and in Putin's Russia. So welcome, Valentina.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure and really awesome to be able to give a speech in Parliament as one of the younger speakers, as far as I can tell. So very cool. And I made a few slides, and actually some of the things I'm going to say will be drawing parallels towards what Carsten said. So that's a bit of a cliffhanger for you. When we talk about political narratives in the Russian media, we cannot avoid talking about the control of the media, because it's a really big part of how the media landscape has been affected, has grown since 1991. So I will take you through, and it will be quite a quick one because we only have 20 minutes, quite a quick overview of how the media and how the control of the media and how this dissemination of political narratives has developed in the media from 1991. But firstly, very quickly, because I'm a media scholar and this is something that I'm really passionate about, why is it even important to look at, why is it so important to look at the media at all in any given society? And according to a lot of media studies scholars, again, this is our empirical field, this is our baby, the media has power, it transmits values, problem definitions, and images of people in society that provide resources for people in thinking about their lives and their relationships to the government, politics, and society. So the media has the power to transform people's opinions, to transform discourses in the society. And by looking at how the media operates in any given society, it actually tells us a lot about that society and about the narratives that are being disseminated and the political landscape as well. And when we talk about the media in Russia today and also the transformation of the media from 1991, we cannot avoid talking about the media in the Soviet times, because especially today, we hear a lot of echoes from the media system in the Soviet Union till today. Censorship, direct censorship, played a very, very big role. So the control of the media was extremely tight. And there were teeny tiny cracks here and there where, for instance, Samizdat came through, which were in these magazines of independent voices that see from society, but it was a very underground initiative. And as Carsten mentioned, we got Gorbachev in 1985. 85. And Gorbachev came with a vision of glasnost and perestroika, and especially glasnost and transparency, open, was very important for the media because we saw these small cracks that were there before, they started getting bigger, and more independent media outlets started arising and arriving, and critique of the government started becoming a thing. But it also led to, with all of these very big transformations, it led to the crack in 1991, the dissolvement of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin comes to power, the jazz hands, and he is actually not that interested strategically in the media. So, in a way, I don't think it was intentional, but he leads the thoughts of glasnost, of openness, of independent media. He leads it on, and this results in an environment of the media in the 90s where we see a lot of commercialization of the media, a lot of decentralization of the media. There are still some media outlets that are owned by the state, partially inspired by glasnost, and partially people were looking towards the West, towards the Western journalistic ideals of objectivity. And some scholars argue that because this way of thinking journalism as very much attached to politics, it merely became an imitation of the Western objective ideals of journalism. And also we still saw very low journalistic professionalism in Russia because this idea of objectivity was very ill-defined. And there was still a very high degree of bias because even though the media, or a lot of the media outlets, were no longer owned directly by the government, they were bought up by oligarchs. And state or enterprises there were politically attached to the state. And this resulted in, again, the media being somewhat free on paper, at least relatively, but in reality, the media was often used for political gains by the oligarchs and still indirectly by the state. And also there were huge flaws in the legal system in terms of press freedom, which did not protect independent media and the media that actually wanted to criticize the government. And a very concrete example of this bias in the media and the media being used for political purposes, political gains, is NTV. It was one of the first independent TV channels in Russia, was quite liberal, quite critical of the state in the 1990s. But the oligarch who owned NTV, when Yeltsin wanted to run for president in 1996, they made a sort of a deal. So NTV actually ended up endorsing Yeltsin, running very positive stories about Yeltsin, although it was, again, I repeat, an independent, on paper television channel that was quite respected. And at least some scholars argued that it led to, or it helped Yeltsin a lot win, because he had a lot of health problems, he had problems with alcohol, he was actually not super popular amongst the population, but because, amongst others, NTV and other media outlets endorsed him, this helped him to victory, at least to some extent. And then we have Putin. New Year shift between 1999 to 2000. Yeltsin goes off as president, he resigns, and he gives the torch of presidential power over to Putin. And Putin got elected in the year of 2000, and Putin was, unlike Yeltsin, very interested in the media. He understood quite quickly that media could be used strategically to manipulate people and to disseminate the narratives that were favorable of the state. So the media from 2000 on, actually the media landscape, the control of the media changed quite a bit. after Putin came to power. We saw a more collaborative approach from the state towards the oligarchs, towards the business world, and this meant that although not all media outlets, large media outlets in Russia, were owned by the state was still able to exercise control over large media outlets, over the mass media, especially television, because in the beginning of 2000s, television was the most important medium. It still is, but its popularity is slowly fading due to the digital devices, digital opportunities that we now see. So Putin understood that he had to, if he really wanted to manipulate with people's opinions and get his stories out there, he needed to gain control of the television primarily. And so he did. NTV, if you remember, this independent television channel, very quickly got a new chief editor who was a lot more friendly towards the states. The other television channels were also pressured quite a lot. And so after Putin came to power, this very implicit and nuanced form of control took place towards the media. And we could see the media outlets and journalists being pressured by fines, by bureaucratic hurdles, by threats sometimes to their lives. As we remember, one of the most famous Russian journalists that was killed, Anna Politkovskaya from Novaya Gazeta, was killed on Putin's birthday in 2006 for reporting a little bit too closely on the war in Chechnya. And so the environment became more tightly controlled by the state. And actually I brought a quote with me from two scholars who looked into the Russian television after the invasion of Ukraine the first time in 2014, that it created an environment where the media, or at least the state-aligned media, largely reproduced the Kremlin narratives instead of reporting on actual events, what we know more from the Western media. And this in turn created an environment where disinformation and propaganda started flourishing in the media. And because this sounds quite bleak, right? But with all of this being said, due to the new digital affordances, due to this new digital environment that was also taking roots in Russia, a lot of independent media outlets started popping up because the borders, the barriers towards entry as a media outlet became smaller on the internet. And we also still had the good old Novaya Gazeta, we also had Echo Moskvy, which has existed since the 1990s. And we also saw independent single voices, such as Yuri Dud, who is a journalist and became very big on YouTube with his views and his critique of the government. And again, with all of this being said, the government also saw the potential of the internet to disseminate their narratives. So the internet in the beginning may have been this utopic place where independent media outlets and voices could flourish and have discussions, but it very quickly also became a discursive battlefield where the narratives of the state also entered, and disinformation and propaganda was being spread that was supported by the government. And now that I've shown you, like, this is a small overview of the independent outlets in Russia, I have to point out that most of these outlets I have to talk about in past tense because a lot has happened in the last 2.5 months in Russia. The independent media, at least the nationwide independent media, is more or less dead. Because after the 24th of February this year, after Russia's landwide invasion of Ukraine, Putin tightened his grip on the media and on information even more. This is something that is unprecedented. We really have not seen this control of information before in Russia. So as much as it is scary and sad, it is also incredibly fascinating for a media studies scholar to experience. And even before 24th of February, there were a few crackdowns or a few points in history that were quite influential when we talk about the control of the media and this tightening of control of the media. One of the first ones were the protests in 2011-2012 in Russia, when Putin ran for president again. As you probably all know, Lidegaard was president from 2008 to 2012, so Putin ran for president again in 2011 and won. The people were not very pleased with this, at least the people from the opposition. And huge protests took place in especially Moscow and St. Petersburg. And the independent media was covering these events, while the state-aligned media largely ignored them. If you turned on the TV, the state-friendly TV stations, you didn't see anything about the protests, even though they were really big if you just went on the street in Moscow, for instance. So after that, there was a crackdown on the independent media, a tightening of control. Another very important point was the Maidan protest in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, as well as Russian invasion of Donbass later that year. Here we also saw a shift in narratives of the state, at least as if they were being reproduced in the state-aligned media, where Ukraine started being portrayed as a Nazi state. This is a narrative that's very familiar to us today as well. A state that had a puppet government that was actually controlled by the West, which by then was being portrayed as a great enemy in Russia. And next point, 2021. Another wave of great protest after the poisoning of Alexei Navalny and his return to Russia and his imprisonment. Huge protests in, again, the bigger cities of Russia. Independent media again playing a very big role in this, both on social media, but also just online on their online platforms. And in the course of 2021, after the crackdown on the demonstrants, we also saw another crackdown on the independent media, with a lot of the independent media outlets being called foreign agents. And I won't go into what this means in practice, because this will take a lot of time, and I also want to show you a clip in the end. But just note that this was also a very important point in this timeline of media control in Russia. And then we have this year, as I already mentioned, the tightening of censorship laws. The war is not allowed to be called a war in Russia still. It is supposed to be called a special military operation. Any mentions of or underminings of the Russian military units is considered a threat, or at least something that can provoke a fine or enjailment for the person spreading this information. And again, this led to all the large independent media outlets being either blocked in Russia or simply closing down and moving their operations abroad. Like Novaya Gazeta, for instance, they opened up very recently a new editorial group in Europe. So now they're making news from Europe, still trying to cover Russia, but from abroad. And this is, of course, incredibly sad, and it has also meant that Kremlin now more or less controls the media and controls the narratives that come out of the media. And what we know is that around 60% of Russians still get their news on TV, and especially television has created this very interesting, I don't know if you can call it, but this very fascinating upside down world of propaganda, where if you turn on the TV, firstly it is still called called special military operation. But the word war is actually starting to seep in. And I've been watching a lot of Russian TV in the last 2.5 months. It's an empirical interest to me. And what I've observed is that the word war, again, is starting to seep in, but it's something that is waged from the side of NATO towards Russia. So the information war and economic war, and lately also military war. And propaganda has also largely increased in Russia since 24th of February. We can see it very plainly again if we look at the television, if we look at how the entertainment programs have been shifted towards nighttime where no one watches them to make space for information programs, fake programs, news programs, anti-fake programs that all reproduce the same narratives that are supported by the state. And I took a small example for you of this reproduction of state narratives, and it draws a parallel to what Carsten said with threats of nuclear war. Now, Putin has been out a few times, Lavrov as well, mentioning often implicitly that Russia has nuclear weapons that they might not be too afraid to use. And in this clip, we'll see how this then has been interpreted by the media. The clip that we will see is from a serious debate program called 60 Minutes. It is hugely popular in Russia. It is aired on Россия 1, which is one of the two largest television channels in Russia, seen all over the country.
Чем привлекательный Южный полюс, а мы сразу знаем, куда это запускать, да? Ну, через Южный полюс, через Северный. Ну, речь идет, у нас только одна цель. Нет, речь идет, конечно, о территории, континентальной территории Соединенных Штатов.
Ну так, на секунду, эта ракета, если окажется там, где, в общем, она могла бы оказаться в худшем случае, способна уничтожить какого рода объекты, какие площади, территории?
Ну, я вам так скажу, что если 7,5 мегатонн будет доставлено на территорию, как говорится, нашего партнера,
Слово партнер не важно.
да, то такие объекты, как город уберет. Хороший город, но его не будет. Вообще. Одной ракеты, конечно. Совсем. От слова совсем. Вот. Поэтому лучше не надо.
On this very bleak note, I will say thank you so much. We still have a bit of time for questions. Rachel?
On the last bit, you showed us about the special military operation by reminding us all that during the Kosovo War, the Danish government was adamant that we did not call it a war. They asked us to call it a military operation other than war. Of course, we didn't obey, but they did. What I wanted to ask you is, could you say a word about the interaction in Russian journalism over this period with academia and think tanks, because they play an important independent role?
Yeah. So thank you for the comment about the special military operation being also used in other contexts. I mean, this is not also a new word for Russia. What happened in Georgia in 2008 was also called a special operation. And when Patriarch Kirill recently went out and said that Russia, it's so amazing that Russia has not waged any wars towards anyone ever, such a peaceful nation, what he drew on was that every war that Russia has entered, they have called it a special military operation. So, yes, to the question of how much the journalists work together with think tanks in academia, this very specific, I honestly do not know. But what I can tell you is that while the media became more independent during the 1980s, the same was also true for academia and for different civil initiatives especially when we talk about women's rights, LGBT rights, because they started getting funding from abroad. Funding from abroad became possible, and this was kind of like a wind in their wheels to work and to do something. So the 1980s, although they were really chaotic and again not the best environment for free journalism either, but they still created an environment where a lot of different initiatives started popping up, amongst them some civil initiatives and also in academia. Yeah.
Og bærlingerne, der kommer der artikel af Julian Artiklerne i bærlingerne på mandag, som jeg har oversat. Den er rigtig god.
Ja, spændende.